This video is about the respiratory system in humans. Now, the diagram in front of you is of the lungs and the associated structures. You need to be able to label a diagram such as this, and each of these different structures should be familiar to you now. Now, air enters the body through the nose or the mouth. It's preferable for air to enter through the nose because the nose passage is warm, as it's lined with numerous blood capillaries. The passage is moist as it secretes mucus, and the passage serves as a filter as it contains hairs that acts as a filter. Now, you need to be familiar with the term pharynx as well. The pharynx is the common passage for both food and air. Two tubes extend downwards from the pharynx. They're the esophagus and the trachea. So the esophagus leads to the stomach, whereas the trachea, which is labelled on the diagram in front of you, is part of the respiratory system. You might also be familiar with the word larynx. The larynx is also known as the voice box. So the trachea, air enters the trachea through the larynx. The trachea wall contains a series of cartilage rings which prevent the trachea wall from collapsing, thus maintaining an open passageway for air. The inner surface of the trachea is lined with cilia, which beat upwards to create air and mucus currents. This stops the entry of small foreign bodies and moves them to the pharynx, where they can then be swallowed and obviously end up in your stomach and being digested or killed. The trachea is divided at its lower end into two bronchi. And again, they're labelled on the diagram in front of you. So you've got these two bronchi. Each bronchus enters a lung, where it then divides and subdivides into progressively smaller and smaller bronchioles. Again, the bronchioles are labelled on the diagram in front of you. Each bronchiole finally opens into one of many alveoli, which are air sacs. You've got approximately 600 million alveoli per lung. Now, the thin alveolar walls are considered the actual respiratory surface. So when we talk about respiratory surfaces with respect to humans or mammals, we're really talking about the surface of the alveoli. The alveoli walls are surrounded by a large network of blood capillaries. Blood receives oxygen from the alveolar air and carries it to the rest of the body, and then it gives out carbon dioxide to the alveoli in return so that it can be breathed out and gotten rid of. So the whole group of alveoli and bronchioles connected to them, together with the huge network of capillaries, constitute the lungs. And all animals possess two lungs, a left one and a right one. Now, this diagram here looks at the muscles in between each of the different ribs. Now, these are the intercostal muscles. There are two groups of intercostal muscles, the internal and external intercostal muscles. Another really important muscle in the mechanism of respiration in humans is the diaphragm. And we'll look at the diaphragm in more detail in a moment. So first of all, looking at the diagram on the left-hand side of inhalation. So during inhalation, the internal muscles between the ribs contract, moving them up. The diaphragm muscle below the lungs contracts and flattens. The chest cavity increases in size, and the internal pressure of the air inside the lungs is reduced. The outside air will therefore flow through the nose, down through the trachea, and finally into the lungs. It's drawn into the lungs. In comparison, during exhalation, the rib muscles relax, or the external intercostal muscles relax, whereas the internal intercostal muscles will contract, pulling the ribs down and in. Meanwhile, the diaphragm relaxes. When it relaxes, it becomes more of a dome shape. The overall volume of the chest cavity is reduced, and the internal pressure is higher, it's increased. As a result, air is forced out of the lungs. During each respiratory cycle, so that's each inhalation and exhalation, the aeration of the lung does not exceed 10% of its capacity. So that's pretty extraordinary, really, to think. This sort of 10% value, this ratio varies according to the state of the individual, between rest and sort of exhaustion, and the depth of inspiration. This diagram here shows the process again. So here we can see the external intercostal muscles contracting on the left-hand side and the diaphragm contracting. That's in inhalation. By comparison, on the right-hand side, we can see the external intercostal muscles are relaxing, whilst the internal intercostal muscles are contracting. As the lungs inflate, so that's in inhalation, stretch receptors send inhibitory impulses to the ventilation center in the brain. This will prevent further expansion from occurring, which would obviously cause a lot of damage. The impulses will then stop, and that will be what allows the muscles to relax, to allow exhalation to occur. Now, I've included this slide because if we were at school, we would do a dissection of the pluck, or specifically sort of we would pump up the lungs, we'd inflate the lungs, we'd see just how light they are. You get to really feel them, you can feel the texture of the lungs. It's quite a useful practical to do. I think it really brings it to life. But I have included a link here to a YouTube video of an individual inflating some lungs, just so that you can see it, as obviously we're unable to do this during remote learning. Now, the final little part of this topic, or this video tutorial, is just on the first breath. So the first breath of life you take. Now, that first breath is approximately 20 times harder than any subsequent breaths. And the reason for that is because before you take your first breath, the elastic tissue has never been stretched before. It's never been extended. The muscle contraction of the ribs and the diaphragm has to therefore overcome elastic recoil of the lungs, as well as in adhesion of the surfaces. So there are special chemicals inside the lungs called lung surfactants that stop the alveoli collapsing, and they stop the surfaces from sticking together. And those lung surfactants make subsequent breaths easier. So in the very first breath you take, the lungs, your lungs are stretched enormously as the air flows in. The elastic tissue will never return to its original size. And so this intake of breath is only possible because of these special chemicals inside the lungs called the lung superfactants. The superfactants contain phospholipids and both hydrophilic and hydrophobic proteins. The fetus only starts to produce enough superfactant from about week 30 of pregnancy, which is one of the reasons why premature babies can struggle to breathe. So in the case of premature babies, artificial surfactants are sprayed into the lungs just to make that breathing process easier.